Destination Nihil by Mark Samuels. I said, "Can I see your ticket, please, sir?" The man to whom the instruction was issued gave a start and appeared to wake from a trance-like state. He rummaged in the pockets of his worn corduroy jacket and finally drew out a crumpled and aged card. The guard, however, did not touch the ticket, but leant forward in order to scrutinize it. At no point did his hands leave his pockets of his stiff jacket. His face, shaded by a conductor's cap, appeared strangely paralytic and expressionless. It was devoid of healthy pallor, being of a bloodless yellow hue. The eyes were too far back in their sockets, as if sinking in the quicksand of bodily decay. Overall, it was too much like a dead face. "Have a pleasant trip, Mr. Graves." The man who had been addressed as Mr. Graves examined the ticket, squinting at the print through his horn-rimmed eyeglasses. The name on the ticket read Douglas Graves, but it meant nothing to him. No starting point or destination was indicated, although the name of the train company, Norak, was emblazoned at the top. I assume, then, the man thought, that I must be Graves. He tried to keep down the wave of panic that threatened to wash over him. "Since I cannot recall what I am doing here on this train," he reasoned, "the only logical conclusion is that I am either an amnesiac or suffering some form of dementia affecting my memory, perhaps with hallucinations thrown in, for good measure. The cadaverous appearance of the train conductor was surely an example of mental turmoil, externalized by a diseased imagination." Graves examined his hands. A few liver spots dappled the skin, and blue veins were prominent. He turned his head to the dusty window and saw his reflection, slightly hazy but still mirror-like in the darkness outside the carriage. His face was paunchy and lined. Thinning white hair crowned his head. His neck had turkey folds. Graves calculated his age to be somewhere between 65 and 70. Perhaps it's senile dementia, he thought, since he appeared to be at the prime age range for its onset. His breath caught in his throat, and he fought back a second wave of panic. Across from him, on the far side of the dividing table and resting on the seat opposite, was a large black suitcase. Its leather surface was scuffed, particularly at the edges, and it looked to have seen a great deal of use. Perhaps there might be an answer in there. If it were his property, then the familiar possessions within might kickstart his memories, or at least give him a foothold in his own identity. The suitcase was atrociously heavy. Graves gasped with the effort as he hauled it onto the table, and then unbuckled the two binding straps that kept the lid down. Once he'd pulled the top open, the smell that wafted out alerted him to its contents before he'd even laid eyes on the interior. The suitcase was full of densely packed earth, and when Graves put his hand inside, turning over the moist and pungent soil, he discovered that it was infested with innumerable wriggling maggots. He closed the lid with a cry of disgust and brushed his hands clean of the black dirt, which clung damply to them. There was no question now of keeping panic in check. Graves loped off along the aisle of the carriage in search of the conductor or of the first person he encountered. A few rows further down, he saw a man slouched in his seat, dressed in a raincoat and a wide-brimmed floppy hat that obscured his face. Graves hesitated before addressing the stranger because he feared the face concealed in shadow. Would it be like that of the conductor? If it were, then he feared he would have reached a tipping point and might scream himself to death. But the stranger was conscious of Graves at his elbow. He looked up and revealed himself to be an ordinary living man, possessed of an ordinary face, albeit one marked by concern at Graves' agitation. "Are you all right?" the stranger said. "You look dreadful. Here, sit down." Graves hesitated for a moment, staring hard at the stranger's face, searching for any kind of abnormality. He could find none. It was the face of a harmless, middle-aged man, slightly wrinkled around his blue eyes, clean-shaven, nondescript, bland in the extreme. It was the face of a million men who are passed on the street every day without leaving any impression in the memory. "Something's wrong," Graves burbled out. "I don't know how I got here. I don't know where I am. I don't even know who I am. You must help me. That guard, for example, there's something—" "Calm down," the stranger interrupted. "You seem to be in shock. I know what it's like. Take it easy. Tell me about it." Graves lowered himself into the seat adjacent to the man, let out a deep breath, and tried to control himself. He ran his hand over his forehead, transferring a cold sheen of sweat to his palm. "My name is Toombs," the middle-aged man said. "Where's this train bound for?" Graves replied. Toombs grimaced. He'd kept his hands hidden within the outside pockets of his raincoat, and had not removed them since Graves had first spotted him. Now he made circular movements, as if twisting them around inside his coat. "Toombs, what's this train's destination?" Graves asked again. "Shush," Toombs whispered. "If the conductor hears you, the destination is not important. The journey is the thing." "What do you know about this train? Look around you," Graves persisted. Toombs's steady gaze looked over the enclosed expanse of the carriage in which the two men were seated. Sickly green paint flaked from the walls. Half of the lamps were broken. The spring suspension in the seats had given way long ago, and deep hollows indicated the presence of thousands of former passengers. The inside of the windows was coated with a layer of dust. In the overhead baggage holders there were dozens of suitcases, all apparently without owners. "What I know," said Toombs, "is that if you insist on making a fuss like this, you're liable to be turned off the train." "Turned off the train just for asking a straightforward question?" Graves was now regarding Toombs with incredulity. Graves had anticipated some anchor in reality, a counterpoint to his own confused mental state, rather than an individual who seemed in an even worse condition than himself. "Of course. But I see you don't yet understand. Have you just woken up? Obviously you've not had the chance to see what's outside yet. Still too dark, I suppose," Toombs said. Graves momentarily turned to the window. It was impossible to discern what was outside, even after he had managed to scrub away some of the grime from the pane with the cuff of his jacket. All he could see was his own reflection peering back at him, and an impenetrable blackness beyond. "I suppose, in a manner of speaking, I have just woken up," Graves said, shifting back into the seat opposite Toombs with a long drawn-out sigh. "It's said that if you die in your dreams, you die in the waking world. But what if you went mad in your dreams? What if you couldn't wake up, and the dream went on, and on, and on?" "What about if you tell me what's really going on here?" Graves interjected, thumping his fist on the table between them. This was no dream. He was certain of that much. There was no blurring around the edges, no non-lineal procession of events, none of the recognized attributes that accompany dreaming. "Plus, perhaps it's not your dream. Perhaps it's mine. Perhaps you're just a made-up character, and I haven't filled you with memories and a past," Toombs said. "I need to find someone talking sense. Excuse me," Graves said, getting to his feet and loping off along the aisle again, swaying slightly with the rocking motion of the carriage. Graves had gone through 16 deserted carriages before he paused for breath. Some were almost in ruins, with their seats torn out and extensive fire damage. he had not encountered another person. He wondered where all the passengers had deserted the whether all the passengers had deserted the train, alighting at an earlier station after having wreaked havoc in the carriages like rampaging football hooligans. Only the elusive ticket inspector could provide an answer, but Graves feared that he might already be in a carriage even further forward in the train, at such a distance that exhaustion would intervene before the man could be intercepted. Graves tried not to think about the prospect any more deeply, and trudged onwards, picking his way through several more carriages choked with debris until he came to a luggage compartment. He noticed at once the moist and pungent smell of earth, and was not surprised to find dozens of large suitcases piled up in the storage area. A couple of their poorly fastened lids had come loose, and the soil within had spilled out on the wooden floor, along with the writhing grubs who had formerly been its inhabitants. The mass of suitcases was not properly secured, and they teetered with each sideways lurch of the train. He leaned down to get a closer look at one of the sickly yellow grubs wriggling around blindly. It was, like its companions, considerably larger than the ones he'd seen back in the suitcase he'd opened just after awakening. These specimens appeared more developed, and Graves noticed that each one was wriggling along the floor towards the back of the compartment, around and beyond the pile of suitcases. Graves followed in the wake of the grubs, taking care not to crush any underfoot, since he thought it would be loathsome to see one of them squashed. Behind the suitcases, he discovered more than a dozen black canvas sacks and secured at the top end by rope. Each contained something that struggled to escape. They were piled up, one on top of another, in a mound. Graves thought that he detected the sound of a low groaning coming from a couple of the formless heaps. The grubs were not making for the occupied sacks, but for the empty ones, even further back in the compartment. Terrified, but unable to resist discovering some part of the solution to the riddle in which he was trapped, Graves pulled one of the sacks from the mound and untied the rope, securing the opening. Graves couldn't make out the thing within clearly, as it huddled up its stunted body to itself as if avoiding the light, but he had the impression of a squashed and boneless parody of humankind. He did, however, see the creature's face before it had turned away. Its lidless eyes were wholly white. Drool oozed from its groaning, gummy mouth. The moaning from the other occupied sacks intensified, as if they were aware of Graves's presence, and were pleading either for his attention or to be left alone. He tied up the end of the sack he'd just opened, returning its occupant to its former state, and hauled the squirming object back onto the mound to rejoin its companions. He stumbled out of the carriage, his legs weak beneath him, shocked and terrified by what he'd seen. Were those half-formed beings the train's hidden cargo on their way to be exterminated? The remains of scientific experiments that had gone horribly wrong? In the corner there was half-light. Dawn had broken, providing feeble illumination across the landscape that could now be seen through the train windows. Graves pulled up the nearest window and leant outside. A chill blast of air buffeted his head, rumpling his white hair and making his eyes water. As far as he could see was a vast and dusty plateau, its monotony broken only by a myriad of tumbleweeds and lunar craters. The sky was a sheet of total blackness. It could not account for the dying dawn creeping across the landscape, trailing gaunt shadows in its wake. Graves tried to see the end or beginning of the train, but it appeared to be turning a huge curve on the railway track, and he was looking at the opposite bend. He passed to the opposite side of the corner and threw open a window there, so he could see the length of the inside bend of the train. Straight ahead, across almost a mile, he spotted a white-haired man staring back at him. The train charted a circle, a gigantic wheel turning endlessly, a self-enclosed universe of carriages, without end or beginning.